Randy Couture versus Chuck Liddell. Before Randy ever faced Chuck, he was fighting at heavyweight and even won the UFC title there. But the thing is, Randy was almost always undersized. He was going up against guys way bigger than him. Eventually, it caught up to him. He lost back-to-back fights to Rico Rodriguez and Josh Barnett, and a lot of people figured he was done. He was 39 years old and on a losing streak. Most fighters would have walked away right then and there. But instead, Randy made a bold move. He dropped down to light heavyweight for the first time ever and took on Chuck Liddell. Chuck was in his prime at the time, and known for putting people to sleep with his hands. People thought Randy was out of his mind for taking the fight. But then came fight night at UFC 43. Randy showed up with the perfect game plan. He stayed in close, mixed in takedowns with dirty boxing, and slowly wore Chuck down. In the third round, he got on top and finished him with ground and pound. That win made Randy the first fighter in UFC history to win undisputed titles in 2 different weight classes. They met again at UFC 52. This time, Chuck came prepared. He stuffed the takedowns, kept the fight standing, and landed a clean right hand that knocked Randy out in the first round. That win earned Chuck the light heavyweight belt and tied the series 1-1. They settled it at UFC 57. Randy tried to close the distance again, but Chuck timed a perfect right hand and finished him in the second round. Chuck took the Trilogy 2-1 and went on to defend his belt multiple times. Both fighters became legends, and this rivalry played a big part in building the UFC during its early boom years. Forrest Griffin versus Tito Ortiz. Their first fight happened way back in 2006 at UFC 59. Forrest was still the new guy, fresh off winning the Ultimate Fighter, while Tito was already a former champ and a big name. Tito came out strong, used his wrestling, and took the first couple rounds. But Forrest didn't fold. He came back hard in the third and made it close. In the end, Tito won by split decision, but a lot of people thought Forrest had done enough to steal it. They ran it back in 2009 at UFC 106. This time, Forrest was the more experienced fighter. The fight was just as close, but Forrest kept the pressure up, stuffed more takedowns, and landed more strikes. It went to another split decision, but this time Forrest got his hand raised. That made it 1-1, and the rubber match came a few years later in 2012 at UFC 148. By then, both guys were a bit past their peak. Tito had already announced it would be his retirement fight. It was emotional, and both of them left everything in the cage. Forrest edged it again, winning the Trilogy 2-1. Then came a weird moment. Right after the fight, Forrest actually ran out of the cage before the official decision was even read. He later said he was frustrated with how he fought and didn't feel like he deserved the win, so he just dipped. Dana had to send someone to bring him back. He made it back just in time to hear his name called. Cain Velasquez versus JDS. This was one of those heavyweight rivalries that defined an era. It all kicked off in 2011 when the UFC wanted to make a big statement with their first ever fight on network TV, partnering with Fox. So they lined up 2 absolute killers. Cain, the relentless wrestler with cardio for days, and JDS, the slick boxer with ridiculous knockout power. The hype was real, but the fight barely lasted a minute. Junior caught Cain early with a perfect overhand right and put him to sleep just 64 seconds in. Just like that, JDS became the heavyweight champ. A lot of fans thought Cain got exposed, but it wasn't that simple. Cain had been out for over a year with a shoulder injury. He wasn't 100%. In the rematch at UFC 155, Cain came back like a machine. He pressured JDS for 5 full rounds, took him down over and over, and landed brutal ground punches. He didn't just win, he completely dominated and reclaimed his title. They ran it back one more time at UFC 166, and it was more of the same. Cain dominated again and closed the Trilogy 2-1. Stipe versus Daniel Cormier. This trilogy felt like a modern-day version of Ali versus Frazier. It all started in 2018. Stipe had just defended the heavyweight belt a record-breaking 3 times, something no other UFC heavyweight had done at that time. Meanwhile, DC was the light heavyweight champ, but he had already fought at heavyweight earlier in his career. So when he moved up to challenge Stipe at UFC 226, it felt like a super fight, champ versus champ. But what no one expected was DC knocking out Stipe, and that's exactly what happened. He got him in the first round with a short right hand, and just like that, he became a 2-division champ. The rematch came at UFC 241, and this time Stipe came in with a new game plan. DC was winning the early rounds, but Stipe adjusted mid-fight, started ripping brutal body shots, and eventually dropped DC in the 4th to reclaim his belt. Now the scores were tied up 1-1. They settled it at UFC 252. Both guys were older, both had something to prove. Stipe fought smart, avoided the clinch work that cost him in the first fight, and outworked DC over 5 rounds to win the Trilogy 2-1. Dustin Poirier versus Conor McGregor. This one had years of build-up. Their first fight happened in 2014 at featherweight. Conor was on the rise, and he got into Dustin's head big time. Then he backed it up by knocking him out in under 2 minutes. That win skyrocketed McGregor's career. They ran it back in 2021, now at lightweight. This time it was all respectful. No trash talk, just two grown men with more experience and bigger goals. At UFC 257, Dustin came in with a smart plan. He attacked Conor's legs with calf kicks, slowed him down, and then knocked him out in the second round. That was McGregor's first knockout loss in MMA. They met a third time that same year at UFC 264. Tensions were back, the build-up was ugly, both guys came in aggressive. The first round was competitive, but right at the end of the round, McGregor stepped back and his lower leg snapped. The doctor stopped the fight, and it went down as a TKO win for Dustin. Trilogy complete 2-1 for Dustin. The ending was unfortunate, but the story that led there made this one of the most talked about rivalries ever. Brandon Moreno versus Davidson Figaredo. This was the first four-fight rivalry in UFC history. It all started at UFC 256 in 2020. Davidson Figaredo was the champ and looked like an absolute monster, finishing guys with power shots and slick submissions. Brandon Moreno, on the other hand, came in as the underdog. He was tough, fast, and skilled, but he wasn't getting the same level of hype. Their first fight turned out to be pure chaos. Both guys had big moments and the pace was insane, but it ended in a majority draw because Davidson got deducted a point for a low blow. Without that, he probably would have won. Still, the fight was so good that fans immediately started calling for a rematch. The UFC didn't waste any time and booked the rematch. This time, Brandon showed up looking like a completely different fighter. He was calm, sharp, and way more technical. He took Davidson down, got his back, and tapped him out in the third round. It was an emotional moment. Brandon became the first Mexican-born UFC champion and won over fans around the world. But Davidson wasn't done. In their next fight, he came in with a better game plan. He dropped Brandon a few times, defended the takedowns, and edged out a close decision win. It was a super competitive fight, and now the series was tied, 1 win each and 1 draw. The fourth and final fight happened at UFC 283, and Brandon dominated again. He was faster, cleaner, and more in control. He landed a solid left hook that caused serious swelling around Davidson's right eye. By the end of the third round, the doctor checked it out and said he couldn't continue. The fight was stopped, and Moreno was declared the winner by TKO. Matt Hughes versus GSP. Back in the early 2000s, Matt was the guy at welterweight. He was strong, mean, and just ragdolled everyone with wrestling and ground and pound. He was already a 2-time champ and had beaten legends like BJ Penn and Carlos Newton. When GSP came along, he was this clean-cut, respectful kid from Canada who idolized Matt. Their first fight was at UFC 50 for the vacant welterweight belt. The fight wasn't even close. Matt submitted him with an armbar in the first round. Fast forward to 2006, they met again at UFC 65. This time, GSP came in looking like a completely different fighter. His striking was sharp, his athleticism was on another level, and he was locked in. He took control early and finished Matt with a TKO in the second round. They ran it back one more time at UFC 79 in 2007, but it wasn't even close. GSP was supposed to fight Matt Serra, but Serra pulled out with an injury, so Hughes stepped in. GSP dominated from start to finish, out-wrestling the wrestler, and submitted Matt with an armbar in round 2. The same move Matt used to beat him the first time. It was a full-circle moment. In the end, GSP took the series 2-1 and went on to become one of the greatest welterweights of all time. Tito Ortiz versus Ken Shamrock. This one was personal, and this rivalry helped put the UFC on the map during a time when the sport was still struggling to gain mainstream attention. It all started when Tito beat one of Ken's fighters and then taunted Ken and his whole team after the fight. He flipped them off and talked trash. Ken, being the face of MMA at the time and a legit legend, took that personally. From that point on, these two hated each other. Their first fight went down at UFC 40 in 2002. It was massive. The UFC hyped it like crazy, and it became one of their best-selling events at the time. Tito was in his prime, Ken was the aging veteran, still tough but past his peak. Tito beat him up badly, forcing a corner stoppage after the third round. But the beef didn't end there. They fought again in 2006 at UFC 61. This time, Tito finished Ken in just over a minute. Some fans thought it was an early stoppage, so the UFC gave them a third fight a few months later, this time on free TV. In the rubber match, Tito once again made quick work of Ken, finishing him in the first round. Tito won the trilogy 3-0, but more than anything, this rivalry helped bring in a whole new wave of fans to the UFC. BJ Penn versus Matt Hughes. This trilogy was all about legacy, two legends with completely different styles. Their first fight happened at UFC 46 in 2004, and it was a shocker. Matt was the welterweight champ and a heavy favorite. BJ was moving up from lightweight, but BJ came in fearless, took Matt's back, and submitted him with a rear naked choke in the first round. It was one of the biggest upsets at the time. They ran it back 2 years later at UFC 63. BJ was dominating the early rounds, outstriking and even outgrappling Matt. But late in the second, BJ's cardio hit a wall. Matt took over and poured on the pressure, and eventually got the TKO in round 3. The Trilogy fight happened in 2010 at UFC 123. Both guys were past their prime by then, but still dangerous. BJ didn't waste any time. He blitzed Matt with a huge right hand and finished him in just 21 seconds. BJ took the series 2-1, but both guys came out as legends. This rivalry wasn't just about wins and losses, it was about legacy and two of the best ever going to war. Frankie Edgar versus Gray Maynard. This is hands down one of the wildest trilogies in UFC history. It had everything from underdog wins to insane comebacks and razor-close battles that kept fans on the edge of their seats. Their first fight happened back in 2008. Frankie was still on the rise and Gray was this powerful wrestler with heavy hands. Gray used his wrestling to control most of the fight and handed Frankie his first professional loss by decision. At the time, it didn't feel like the start of a trilogy. Just two contenders grinding it out. There was no hype or reason for another fight. Fast forward to 2011, Frankie was now the lightweight champ, having beaten BJ Penn twice. Gray had earned his shot at the belt, so a rematch was set. Gray almost finished Frankie in the first round with a brutal barrage. Most guys would have been done right there, but Frankie somehow survived and made it a 5-round war. The fight ended in a majority draw, which meant Frankie kept the belt, but now fans were begging for a third fight. That led to the Trilogy fight at UFC 136 later that year. And again, Gray came out strong, hurting Frankie early. But just like before, Frankie dug deep. This time, he didn't let it go to the scorecards. He came back, turned the tide, and knocked Gray out in the 4th round to close the Trilogy. The series ended with 1 win each and 1 draw, making it perfectly even. It's one of those trilogies that doesn't always get the spotlight it deserves, but every fight was absolutely unforgettable. Max Holloway versus Alexander Vulcganowski. This trilogy between Max Holloway and Alexander Vulcganowski was one of the most debated in UFC history. Before these two ever fought, Max was the undisputed king at featherweight. He ran through the division and beat legends like Aldo twice. People were calling him the best featherweight of all time. Then came Vulcganowski. He wasn't a big name at first, but the guy was a tank. He was short, explosive, and fought with a high fight IQ. At UFC 245, they met for the first time. Vulcganowski came in with a perfect game plan. He chopped at Max's legs nonstop and stayed just out of range. After 5 rounds, he shocked the world and took Max's belt. The rematch happened a few months later at UFC 251, and this one sparked major controversy. Max came out like a man on a mission. He dropped Vulcganowski twice early, looked way sharper, and most fans thought he clearly won. But when the judges read the scorecards, it was a split decision for Vulcganowski. The MMA world exploded. A lot of people felt Max got robbed. The UFC didn't book a trilogy right away. Max had to take out contenders just to earn another shot, and he did exactly that, putting on an absolute show against Calvin Kattar and Yair Rodriguez. And finally, long overdue match was set at UFC 276. But this time, Vulcganowski shut the door for good. He didn't just win, he dominated. He looked faster, stronger, and more confident than ever. Max had no answers. This ended with 3-0 Alex. Tim Sylvia versus Andrei Arlovski. Tim Sylvia and Andrei Arlovski had very different styles. Arlovski was the fast, explosive striker, while Sylvia was this massive, towering dude with heavy hands and underrated toughness. They first fought in 2005 at UFC 51. Arlovski was on a roll and had just been crowned interim champ. It didn't take long for him to drop Sylvia with a slick right hand and lock up a heel hook to get the quick submission. Just like that, Arlovski looked like the future of the division. But Sylvia wasn't done. They rematched a year later at UFC 59, and this time it was Sylvia who flipped the script. Arlovski dropped him early, but Sylvia recovered fast and landed a huge right hand that put Arlovski on the mat. He swarmed him with punches on the ground and got the TKO win. That tied it up 1-1, and Sylvia became the new champ. The Trilogy fight came just a few months later at UFC 61. Everyone was hyped, 2 knockout artists, 1 belt on the line, but the fight didn't deliver. Both guys were super cautious and barely engaged. After 5 slow rounds, Sylvia won by decision and kept his title, but fans were kind of disappointed by how it ended. Sylvia won the Trilogy 2-1, but Arlovski stayed the fan favorite. Randy Couture versus Vitor Belfort. This trilogy is a throwback to the early days of the UFC, back when legends were still being made and the sport was raw. Randy Couture and Vitor Belfort were 2 of the biggest names at the time. Both champions, both dangerous, but in very different ways. Randy was the wrestling grinder, the guy who could drag anyone into deep waters. Vitor was the young phenom with blistering hand speed and brutal knockouts. They first fought all the way back in 1997 at UFC 15. Vitor came in hot, destroying everyone in seconds. People thought he'd steamroll Randy too. But Randy didn't think so. He used his wrestling and clinch work to completely shut Vitor down. He got him to the ground, controlled him, and finished him with strikes. That was the moment Randy went from an Olympic wrestler to a legit MMA threat. Their second fight didn't happen until 2004, and this time it was for the UFC light heavyweight title. Couture caught Randy early, but not in the way you'd expect. He accidentally sliced Randy's eyelid with the edge of his glove just 49 seconds into the fight. The doctor stopped it and Couture won the belt, but nobody was satisfied with how it ended. So they ran it back right away later that year at UFC 49. Randy came in with a point to prove. He absolutely dominated from start to finish. Couture had no answer. Randy beat him up for 3 full rounds until the ref stepped in. The trilogy closed 2-1 for Randy, and both guys cemented themselves as icons. Charles Oliveira versus Nick Lentz. This one doesn't get talked about a lot, but Charles versus Nick was a sneaky trilogy that stretched across almost a decade. It didn't have the spotlight or trash talk like some of the other rivalries, but it was an important part of Oliveira's journey to the top. The first time they fought was back in 2011. Charles was still a young prospect with flashy jiu-jitsu, while Lentz was more of a grinder. The fight looked like a solid win for Oliveira after he landed a big knee and locked in a choke. But here's the twist. The knee turned out to be illegal. It hit Lentz while he was technically grounded. The commission reviewed it and overturned the result to a no contest. So no winner and unfinished business. They met again in 2015, and this time there was no controversy. Charles came in looking sharper, more experienced, and way more dangerous. He showed off his striking, hurt Lentz on the feet, and then did what he always does, snatched the neck and finished the fight with a slick guillotine in the 3rd round. Fast forward to 2019, they ran it back one last time. By then, Charles was evolving into a complete fighter. His hands were better, his confidence was through the roof, and he looked levels ahead. Lentz was still tough as always, but Charles overwhelmed him. He landed heavy shots and ended the fight with a clean knockout in round 2. This became his first KO in the UFC. Oliveira took the rivalry with 2-0 with 1 no contest. Frankie Edgar versus BJ Penn. This trilogy marked the change of an era. BJ Penn was the legend, the guy everyone feared at lightweight. Frankie Edgar was the underdog, the scrappy Jersey kid. Nobody expected him to be a match for BJ. Their first fight was at UFC 112 in 2010. BJ came in as the reigning champ and was on a tear. He had just destroyed guys like Diego Sanchez and Kenny Florian, and most people thought he'd walk through Edgar, but Edgar came in with speed and a perfect game plan. He stayed light on his feet, circled constantly, and outlanded BJ. It was close, but the judges gave it to Edgar by unanimous decision, and people were shocked. Because of how close it was, the UFC ran it back right away at UFC 118. This time, there was no debate. Frankie looked even better. He stuffed all of BJ's takedowns, used angles to avoid big shots, and completely outclassed him over 5 rounds. Edgar walked away with a clear decision to prove the first one wasn't luck. They fought a 3rd time, but it didn't happen until 2014. BJ moved down to featherweight for one last shot at redemption, but this wasn't the same Penn. He came in with a strange upright stance, looked slow and out of rhythm, and Edgar took full advantage. That fight ended BJ Penn's career in the UFC, and Frankie walked away 3-0 in the rivalry.